I'm so sorry. I'll clean it up.
Security! Remove this housekeeper immediately!
There are moments in life when a single sentence can expose years of hidden character. Sometimes it is not the boardroom that reveals who people truly are. It is not a courtroom, a business deal, or a signed contract. Sometimes the greatest test happens in the quiet corners of a home, where people believe no one important is paying attention. On what was supposed to be one of the happiest afternoons in a wealthy American family's history, an elderly housekeeper knelt on a polished marble floor, trembling as shattered pieces of an expensive crystal vase scattered around her feet. The silence lasted only a heartbeat before it was broken by a young woman whose wedding was only weeks away. Her voice echoed through the mansion with a level of anger that left every person standing frozen. She called the elderly woman careless, useless, and unfit to work in the house. She demanded that security remove her immediately. Then she issued an ultimatum that stunned everyone present. If the old maid was not dismissed before sunset, there would be no wedding. Family members exchanged uneasy glances. Employees lowered their heads. No one stepped forward to defend the frightened woman, who remained on her knees apologizing over and over again. To everyone in that room, she was simply another aging servant who had made an unfortunate mistake. But there was one truth hidden beneath that simple scene. One truth so extraordinary that it would soon change every life connected to that mansion forever. The elderly maid was not a maid at all. She was one of the wealthiest women in America, a self-made billionaire whose name had appeared on magazine covers, business journals, and television interviews for decades. Yet no one recognized her beneath the gray wig, simple glasses, worn shoes, and modest uniform she had carefully chosen for this unbelievable experiment. Not the household staff, not the family friends, not even her own son, the man preparing to marry the woman who had just humiliated her. And perhaps the most remarkable part of this entire story was that the son himself had no idea why his mother had chosen to disappear from the public eye and secretly enter his home under a false identity. He believed she had accepted a long overseas vacation months earlier. Instead, she had quietly returned, determined to answer a question that had haunted her ever since her son announced his engagement. Was the woman he loved truly in love with him, or had she simply fallen in love with the extraordinary life that surrounded his family name? As the room remained silent, the elderly woman slowly pushed herself to her feet. She looked at the broken glass for only a moment before lifting her eyes toward the furious fiancé. Then, with remarkable calm, she smiled gently and spoke just one sentence that nobody in that mansion understood at the time. "Thank you. I now know everything I needed to know." Those words seemed almost meaningless in the moment, but before the day was over, they would expose deception, challenge assumptions, reveal remarkable compassion, and force an entire family to confront the difference between appearance and character. Stories like this remind us that wealth can purchase almost anything except certainty about the people who stand closest to us. It is easy to be kind when everyone believes you are powerful. The real measure of a person often appears when they think they are dealing with someone who has nothing to offer them in return. Before we go deeper into this extraordinary true story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened inside this mansion over the following days became a lesson that no amount of money could ever buy. And by the end of this story, you may find yourself asking a question that countless people have debated ever since the truth finally came to light. If you believed you were standing before an ordinary servant with no influence, no fortune, and no voice, how would your own actions have measured against hers? The woman behind the disguise had spent decades building a reputation that most people believed was impossible to earn. Across America, business magazines praised her discipline, television hosts admired her resilience, and financial analysts studied the remarkable company she and her late husband had built from almost nothing. To the public, she was known as Evelyn Whitmore, a billionaire whose name represented success, integrity, and determination. But the headlines never told the full story. They never spoke about the countless nights she and her husband spent wondering how they would pay their employees while choosing to go without salaries themselves. They never described the years they sacrificed birthdays, anniversaries, and family vacations because every dollar they earned had to be reinvested into the business they believed would one day change their family's future. Most importantly, the public never understood how quickly wealth could transform the people around you. Evelyn had watched distant relatives suddenly remember her birthday after she became successful. She had seen old acquaintances appear with investment proposals, emotional stories, and promises of lifelong loyalty that vanished the moment they realized she would not write them a check. She had attended charity galas where strangers praised her generosity while quietly calculating the size of her fortune. Every experience taught her the same difficult lesson. Money could attract admiration, but it could never guarantee sincerity. After losing her husband several years earlier, that lesson became even more painful because she realized she no longer had the one person who always knew when someone was being genuine and when someone was simply performing. She carried that burden alone, and although she rarely allowed anyone to see it, the fear of losing the family they had worked so hard to build never completely disappeared. That fear grew stronger the day her only son, Evelyn Whitmore, walked into her office wearing a smile she had not seen since he was a little boy. He told her he had met someone extraordinary. Her name was Lauren Mitchell, a talented young architect whose intelligence, confidence, and warmth had completely changed his life. Ethan spoke about Lauren with the kind of excitement that only genuine love could produce. He described how she challenged him, encouraged him, laughed with him, and made him believe that the future could be even brighter than the life he already enjoyed. Evelyn listened carefully, and despite every protective instinct she carried as both a mother and the head of one of America's largest privately owned companies, she wanted to believe every word. When she finally met Lauren for the first time, she understood why her son had fallen in love. Lauren was graceful without appearing arrogant. She spoke thoughtfully, she carried herself with confidence, and she never seemed intimidated by the wealth surrounding the Whitmore family. The dinner ended with smiles, laughter, and what appeared to be the beginning of a wonderful relationship. Even so, Evelyn noticed small moments that everyone else overlooked. They were not dramatic enough to raise an accusation, nor obvious enough to convince anyone that something was wrong. They were simply tiny reactions that lingered in her mind long after the evening ended. Lauren seemed especially interested whenever conversations turned toward family trusts, company ownership, or inheritance planning. She always recovered quickly, changing the subject before anyone became suspicious. But Evelyn had spent a lifetime negotiating with executives, investors, and competitors. She had learned that the smallest expressions often revealed far more than carefully chosen words. Still, she refused to judge Lauren based on instinct alone because she understood how dangerous assumptions could be. If she was going to place doubt between her son and the woman he intended to marry, she needed something far stronger than a feeling. Over the weeks that followed, Ethan became increasingly excited about planning the wedding, while Evelyn found herself asking a question she could not silence. Was Lauren truly the compassionate woman Ethan believed she was? Or was she simply adapting herself to fit the expectations of one of America's wealthiest families? Hiring private investigators would only uncover financial records and public information. Surveillance would reveal routines but not character. Background checks could verify employment history, but never explain what a person would do when they believed nobody important was watching. Evelyn wanted something deeper than evidence collected from documents. She wanted the truth that only ordinary moments could reveal. That desire eventually led her to create a plan so unusual that even her closest advisors begged her to abandon it. She announced publicly that she would be leaving the country for an extended European vacation to recover from years of nonstop work. Interviews were canceled, public appearances disappeared from the calendar. The media accepted the explanation without question, and within days, everyone believed the billionaire matriarch had left America behind for several peaceful months abroad. In reality, Evelyn Whitmore never boarded the international flight that had been carefully arranged for photographers to witness. Instead, she quietly disappeared into a private residence owned through an anonymous holding company where professional makeup artists, costume specialists, and a trusted retired theater consultant helped transform one of the most recognizable women in American business into someone no one would ever notice. Gray hair replaced her elegant hairstyle. Fine lines appeared across her face through expertly applied makeup. Her posture changed. Her expensive wardrobe disappeared beneath simple housekeeping uniforms purchased from an ordinary supplier. She practiced speaking more softly, walking more slowly, and carrying herself with the humility of someone who had spent decades serving others. By the time the transformation was complete, Evelyn Whitmore had disappeared completely. In her place stood an elderly housekeeper named Margaret, and within only a few days, Margaret would quietly walk through the front door of her own son's mansion, beginning the extraordinary chain of events that would eventually explain why she had calmly smiled after the shattered crystal vase and whispered those unforgettable words, "Thank you. I now know everything I needed to know." For the first few days, nothing extraordinary happened, and that was precisely what Evelyn Whitmore had hoped for. Real character rarely reveals itself during grand celebrations or carefully planned family dinners. It appears during ordinary routines, quiet conversations, and moments that people assume no one else will ever remember. Under the name Margaret, Evelyn settled naturally into the rhythm of the Whitmore household. She prepared breakfast before sunrise, folded fresh laundry, polished silverware that had been passed down through 3 generations of the family, watered the gardens, and quietly moved from room to room with the kind of invisible presence that many household employees unfortunately experience every day. The remarkable part was not how convincing her disguise had become. It was how quickly everyone stopped noticing her altogether. Guests walked past without making eye contact. Contractors discussed confidential matters while she dusted bookshelves nearby. Friends of the family continued conversations as if she were part of the furniture. Even Ethan, her own son, greeted her politely but never looked long enough to recognize the woman who had raised him. Evelyn did not blame him. She had deliberately changed everything from her voice to the way she carried herself. Still, there was something deeply emotional about standing only a few feet away from her son while listening to him thank a stranger for preparing his morning coffee. She felt proud watching the respectful man he had become. He thanked every employee by name, offered to carry heavy boxes whenever he saw someone struggling, and regularly reminded Lauren that the people working inside the house deserved appreciation because they made everyone's lives easier. Those small acts of kindness confirmed what Evelyn had always believed about Ethan. Success had never changed his heart. If anything, it had strengthened the values his father had worked so hard to teach him. Yet while Ethan treated every employee with consistent respect, whether anyone was watching or not, Lauren's behavior seemed to shift depending on the circumstances. She was never openly cruel during the first several days. In fact, if Ethan happened to be standing nearby, she often complimented Margaret's cooking, thanked her for cleaning the guest rooms, and smiled warmly whenever visitors were present. But once Ethan left for meetings at Whitmore Holdings, the atmosphere inside the mansion subtly changed. Lauren became noticeably impatient over minor inconveniences. A towel folded differently from her preference resulted in visible frustration. A breakfast served only a few minutes later than expected earned a disappointed sigh. A misplaced flower arrangement brought criticism that seemed unnecessary, considering the mistake itself. None of these incidents alone proved anything meaningful. Everyone has stressful days, especially while planning a wedding that would undoubtedly attract national media attention because of the Whitmore family's prominence. Evelyn reminded herself repeatedly that isolated moments should never define an entire person. She refused to reach conclusions too quickly because she understood better than anyone how dangerous first impressions could be. Yet every evening, after quietly returning to the small staff quarters prepared for Margaret, she found herself replaying the day's events in her mind, searching for patterns instead of isolated incidents. She wasn't looking for perfection. She simply wanted to know whether Lauren's kindness depended upon who happened to be watching. Everything became far more complicated late one Thursday afternoon, when an unexpected visitor arrived at the mansion. Lauren's mother, Patricia Mitchell, had come to discuss final wedding arrangements, while Ethan remained downtown attending an important board meeting. Margaret was arranging fresh flowers in the dining room when the two women stepped into the adjoining library, believing they were completely alone. Evelyn had no intention of listening to a private conversation, but as she quietly reached for a vase near the doorway, one sentence immediately caught her attention. Patricia asked her daughter whether she had finally convinced Ethan to move the wedding date forward. Lauren hesitated before answering in a tone far different from the confident voice she usually presented to the Whitmore family. She admitted she was growing increasingly nervous, not because of the wedding itself, but because she still felt as though Evelyn Whitmore had never fully accepted her. Lauren confessed that she often worried she would always be viewed as an outsider, simply because she came from a middle-class family instead of a powerful business dynasty. Patricia tried to reassure her, reminding her that genuine love mattered more than money, social status, or corporate influence. For a brief moment, Evelyn questioned everything she had been thinking. Perhaps she had completely misunderstood Lauren from the beginning. Perhaps the small moments she had observed were nothing more than the understandable pressure of entering one of America's wealthiest families. As Evelyn quietly continued arranging flowers, She felt something she had not experienced since beginning this unusual experiment. She felt guilty. Had she allowed years of disappointment to make her suspicious of someone who genuinely loved her son? Had the losses and betrayals of her own past quietly influenced the way she interpreted every small interaction? Those questions stayed with her long after Patricia left the mansion that afternoon. But before the day was over, another conversation would erase every certainty she had just begun to rebuild. It would introduce a new player into this story, someone whose ambitions reached far beyond Ethan and Lauren's wedding, someone whose carefully hidden plans threatened not only the future of the Whitmore family, but the very company Evelyn and her late husband had sacrificed their lives to build. And unlike the shattered crystal vase that had started this remarkable chain of events, this discovery could not simply be swept away. That evening, the Whitmore mansion settled into the kind of quiet that often follows an exhausting day of wedding planning. The decorators had finally left. The caterers had packed away their samples. The event coordinator had driven away with another folder full of last-minute adjustments, leaving only the household staff and a handful of family members inside the enormous estate. Ethan was still attending meetings at Whitmore Holdings, while Lauren had told everyone she wanted to spend the evening reviewing seating arrangements and vendor contracts. Margaret, still hidden beneath Evelyn Whitmore's carefully crafted disguise, continued with her routine duties as though nothing unusual had happened that afternoon. Yet her thoughts kept returning to Lauren's conversation with Patricia Mitchell. The vulnerability she had heard sounded sincere. It reminded Evelyn of her own younger years, when she often questioned whether she belonged in rooms filled with wealthy executives who had inherited fortunes she and her late husband had spent decades building from scratch. For the first time since creating this extraordinary test, Evelyn wondered if she had allowed old disappointments to cloud her judgment. She even considered ending the experiment altogether. If Lauren truly feared rejection because of her background, rather than secretly pursuing the Whitmore fortune, perhaps continuing the disguise would only create unnecessary pain for everyone involved. But experience had taught Evelyn never to make important decisions based solely on emotion. She chose instead to remain patient for just a little longer, believing that truth, whether comforting or painful, always revealed itself with enough time. Only minutes later, that patience was rewarded in a way she never expected. While carrying freshly pressed table linens toward the east wing, Margaret noticed that one of the study doors had been left slightly open. She intended to walk quietly past without interrupting whoever might be inside, but a familiar voice immediately caused her to stop. It was Lauren. Her tone was calm, though noticeably different from the uncertainty she had expressed earlier to her mother. Evelyn remained completely still, hidden from view by the hallway's decorative columns. Another voice answered Lauren, this one unmistakably belonging to Ethan's cousin, Nathan Whitmore. Nathan had worked within Whitmore Holdings for years and publicly presented himself as one of Ethan's strongest supporters. He often spoke proudly about preserving the Whitmore legacy and frequently volunteered to help with wedding preparations, earning everyone's trust through his dependable nature. Yet something about this private meeting immediately felt unusual. Nathan reminded Lauren that the family trust would soon undergo several structural changes after the marriage. Lauren responded carefully, explaining that she had no interest in discussing financial matters before the wedding because she wanted Ethan to know she loved him for reasons that had nothing to do with money. Nathan laughed softly before telling her she was thinking far too emotionally. He insisted that opportunities like this appeared only once in a lifetime and warned her that Evelyn Whitmore had spent decades protecting every dollar she owned. According to Nathan, unless Lauren learned how the family's corporate structure worked, she would always remain an outsider with no meaningful influence over Ethan's future. Lauren quickly interrupted him, making it clear she had never asked for advice about controlling Whitmore Holdings. She reminded Nathan that her relationship with Ethan had begun long before anyone discussed inheritance, board positions, or ownership shares. Her frustration sounded genuine, but Nathan refused to let the conversation end there. He continued planting subtle ideas, suggesting that once married, she should encourage Ethan to distance himself from his mother's influence because younger leadership would supposedly modernize the company. Every sentence sounded less like friendly advice and more like someone carefully guiding another person toward decisions that primarily benefited himself. Standing silently in the hallway, Evelyn felt the pieces of a much larger puzzle beginning to connect. Nathan was not openly attacking either Ethan or Lauren. Instead, he appeared determined to place invisible distance between them and everyone else in the Whitmore family. If Lauren accepted his suggestions, Ethan might slowly begin questioning his mother's judgment. If Evelyn reacted harshly toward Lauren based on misunderstandings, Ethan could easily believe his fiancée was being treated unfairly. The result would be exactly what Nathan seemed to want: a divided family whose disagreements created opportunities for someone else to gain influence within Whitmore Holdings. It was an approach that required patience rather than confrontation, and that realization unsettled Evelyn more than any dramatic accusation ever could. Before she could quietly leave the hallway, Lauren ended the conversation with words that completely changed Evelyn's understanding of her. Lauren firmly told Nathan never to discuss Ethan's family that way again. She explained that while she and Evelyn might still be learning to understand each other, she would never participate in anything that encouraged conflict between a son and his mother. Nathan attempted to dismiss her concerns with another laugh, but Lauren ended the meeting immediately and walked away without another word. As Margaret carefully stepped back into the shadows to avoid being seen, Evelyn felt both relief and renewed concern. Lauren had just defended her without realizing the elderly maid, standing only a few feet away, was actually the woman she had protected. Yet Nathan's calculated behavior raised questions that could no longer be ignored. Why was he working so hard to influence Lauren before the wedding? Why did he seem so interested in creating distance within the Whitmore family? And perhaps most troubling of all, how many similar conversations had already taken place beyond anyone else's knowledge? Evelyn realized her experiment had quietly shifted in ways she never anticipated. She had entered her son's home believing she was testing the character of his future wife. Now she was beginning to suspect that someone else inside the Whitmore family's inner circle had been orchestrating events from the very beginning. The shattered crystal vase had exposed one layer of truth, but what Evelyn had just witnessed suggested that the greatest threat to her family had never been standing in the middle of the living room. It had been walking confidently through the halls all along, wearing the familiar face of someone everyone believed they could trust. From that moment forward, Evelyn Whitmore realized that her experiment could no longer remain as simple as observing whether Lauren Mitchell treated an elderly housekeeper with dignity. The purpose had quietly changed. She was now trying to understand whether the tension she had sensed since Ethan Whitmore announced his engagement had been growing naturally, or whether someone had been carefully nurturing it from the beginning. She refused to accuse Nathan Whitmore based on a single private conversation, because decades of leading one of America's most respected companies had taught her that assumptions could destroy innocent lives just as quickly as proven lies. She needed facts, patterns, and actions that spoke louder than words. So, instead of ending her disguise, she decided to remain Margaret for a little while longer. Over the following week, she watched Nathan with the same patience she had originally reserved for Lauren. The difference became noticeable almost immediately. Nathan never raised his voice. He never openly criticized anyone. He never behaved in a way that would immediately attract suspicion. Instead, he preferred quiet suggestions delivered at exactly the right moments. If Ethan praised Lauren's ideas for the wedding, Nathan would casually remark that Evelyn usually preferred more traditional family ceremonies. If Evelyn complimented Ethan's recent leadership at Whitmore Holdings during a phone call everyone believed she was making from Europe, Nathan would later tell Ethan that successful sons eventually needed to step out from their parents' shadows. Every comment seemed harmless by itself. Together, however, they painted a very different picture. Nathan rarely created conflict directly. He planted tiny doubts and allowed other people to nurture them on their own. It was a strategy that required remarkable patience because the person responsible almost never appeared connected to the disagreement once it finally surfaced. Evelyn had seen similar tactics used by corporate competitors during hostile takeover attempts, but seeing the same approach quietly unfolding inside her own family filled her with a sadness that no business negotiation had ever caused. Meanwhile, Lauren continued revealing different sides of herself whenever she believed no one important was watching. One rainy afternoon, Margaret accidentally overheard a conversation between Lauren and one of the newer kitchen assistants, a young single mother who had recently joined the household staff after struggling to support her little daughter. The young employee apologized repeatedly after burning one of the desserts prepared for an upcoming family dinner, clearly terrified that she might lose the job she desperately needed. Before Margaret could even offer reassurance, Lauren stepped into the kitchen. Evelyn immediately prepared herself to witness another uncomfortable exchange, similar to the one involving the crystal vase. Instead, Lauren quietly dismissed everyone else from the room before helping the young woman prepare the dessert again from the beginning. She explained that mistakes were part of learning and admitted she had made far worse errors during her first years as an architect. The frightened employee began crying, confessing that she had been afraid of disappointing everyone because she could not afford another dismissal. Lauren placed a comforting hand on her shoulder and told her that people deserved opportunities, not labels based on one difficult moment. Margaret stood silently outside the kitchen doorway, unable to ignore the contradiction between the woman she had just watched and the woman who had publicly humiliated an elderly maid only days earlier. The difference was impossible to reconcile. How could the same person who comforted a frightened employee also demand that security remove an older housekeeper in front of an entire room of guests? Evelyn replayed the incident with the shattered crystal vase repeatedly in her mind. Had Lauren genuinely lost control because of overwhelming stress? Or had there been another factor hidden beneath the surface that no one, including Evelyn herself, had recognized at the time? The more answers she uncovered, the more complicated every conclusion became. Then another unexpected detail forced Evelyn to question everything once again. While organizing old family photographs in the mansion's library, Margaret discovered a leather-bound wedding planning journal that Lauren had accidentally left behind after meeting with the event coordinator. Evelyn had no intention of reading someone else's personal notes, but as she reached to place the journal safely on a nearby table, a folded sheet of paper slipped onto the floor. She instinctively picked it up before anyone stepped into the room. What she saw was not a list of luxury purchases or expensive honeymoon plans. It was a handwritten letter that Lauren had apparently begun writing to Ethan but never finished. In careful, heartfelt words, she admitted how frightened she felt about becoming part of the Whitmore family. She confessed that she often worried people believed she was chasing wealth simply because she happened to fall in love with a billionaire's son. She wrote that the greatest compliment she could ever receive from Evelyn Whitmore would not be approval of the wedding itself, but genuine belief that her love for Ethan existed long before she understood the true scale of the Whitmore fortune. Lauren ended the unfinished letter with a sentence that left Evelyn standing completely still. She wrote that if she ever had to choose between Ethan's inheritance and Ethan himself, she would gladly walk away from every dollar, because the life they dreamed of building together mattered far more than any company, mansion, or family fortune. Evelyn slowly folded the letter exactly as she had found it and carefully returned it to the journal without leaving any sign that it had ever been touched. As she quietly walked away, she felt an unfamiliar weight settling on her heart. For the first time since disguising herself as Margaret, she began wondering whether the greatest mistake in this extraordinary experiment had not been Lauren's behavior at all. Perhaps the person being tested without realizing it was Evelyn herself. Perhaps this entire journey had become less about discovering Lauren's character and more about confronting the fears that years of wealth, betrayal, and loss had quietly built inside her own heart. But before she could answer that deeply personal question, an unexpected phone call would arrive at the Whitmore mansion the following morning, bringing news that would force every member of the family into the same room once again. And before that gathering came to an end, someone would attempt to destroy far more than a crystal vase. The following morning began with an unusual urgency that spread through the Whitmore mansion long before sunrise. Housekeepers moved more quickly than usual. Security officers received unexpected instructions through their radios, and members of the executive staff arrived hours earlier than anyone had anticipated. Margaret, still hidden beneath Evelyn Whitmore's carefully maintained disguise, quietly continued preparing breakfast while observing the sudden change in atmosphere. Within minutes, she learned the reason. Whitmore Holdings had received notice that one of its largest international investors had requested an emergency meeting that afternoon. The investment represented years of expansion, thousands of employees, and projects that affected communities across several states. Although Ethan Whitmore assured everyone there was no immediate reason to worry, he admitted the timing could not have been worse. The wedding was only weeks away. Reporters had already begun speculating about the family's celebrations, and now an unexpected corporate issue demanded the full attention of senior leadership. Nathan Whitmore immediately volunteered to coordinate communication between the family and the executive team, presenting himself once again as the dependable cousin willing to shoulder additional responsibility. No one questioned his enthusiasm. In fact, several executives openly thanked him for stepping forward. Margaret simply watched in silence. She had spent decades leading Whitmore Holdings, and one lesson had remained constant throughout every negotiation she had ever faced. People who quietly seek responsibility often deserve it. People who eagerly seek control during moments of uncertainty deserve much closer attention. As preparations for the emergency meeting continued, another incident unfolded inside the mansion that seemed insignificant to everyone except Margaret. One of the longtime gardeners accidentally damaged an expensive decorative fountain while moving equipment across the courtyard. The loud crack echoed through the estate, immediately drawing the attention of household staff and family members. The elderly gardener, who had faithfully worked for the Whitmore family for more than 20 years, stood frozen beside the broken stone feature with obvious fear written across his face. Margaret immediately recognized him. His name was Samuel, and Evelyn remembered attending the funeral of his wife nearly a decade earlier after she lost her battle with cancer. Samuel had remained loyal to the Whitmore family despite every hardship life had placed before him. Before anyone else could react, Lauren Mitchell hurried into the courtyard after hearing the noise. Margaret instinctively held her breath, remembering all too clearly the humiliation she herself had experienced after the crystal vase shattered across the marble floor. For a brief moment, Lauren stared silently at the damaged fountain. Samuel lowered his head and apologized repeatedly, explaining that his hands had slipped because of persistent pain caused by arthritis. Instead of expressing anger, Lauren gently interrupted him. She asked whether he had injured himself, helped him sit on a nearby bench, and instructed another employee to bring water while she personally contacted the family physician to examine his wrist. When Samuel continued apologizing for the costly damage, Lauren quietly smiled and reminded him that fountains could always be repaired, but people could not be replaced. Margaret watched every moment without saying a word. The contrast between this scene and the opening confrontation involving the crystal vase became impossible to ignore. One reaction reflected patience, empathy, and genuine concern. The other remained completely inconsistent with everything Lauren had shown since then. Evelyn found herself returning once again to the unanswered question that refused to leave her thoughts. What had truly happened on the afternoon the crystal vase fell to the floor? Had she witnessed Lauren's real character? Or had she witnessed someone reacting to circumstances carefully manipulated by another person? The answer began revealing itself only hours later. As executives gathered inside the mansion before departing for Whitmore Holdings, Margaret carried fresh coffee into one of the smaller conference rooms, where Nathan had been making several private telephone calls throughout the morning. Believing he was alone, Nathan spoke with a confidence Margaret had never heard before. His voice remained calm, but every sentence carried unmistakable purpose. He assured the person on the other end of the call that everything was unfolding exactly as planned. He confidently stated that the emergency investors meeting would place Ethan under enormous pressure, making him more willing to rely on family advice during the coming weeks. Then Nathan said something that caused Margaret to stop walking altogether. He referred to the incident involving the shattered crystal vase as the perfect beginning. He laughed quietly before explaining that once people began doubting each other's character, rebuilding trust became almost impossible. Every disagreement afterward would seem larger than it truly was because suspicion had already taken root. Margaret felt her heartbeat quicken beneath the plain housekeeping uniform. Nathan had just confirmed something Evelyn had only begun to suspect. The confrontation between Lauren and the elderly maid had never been an isolated family argument. Someone had expected that moment to happen. Someone had intended for emotions to rise high enough that relationships would begin quietly falling apart afterward. Before Margaret could hear anything further, Nathan suddenly ended the conversation after noticing footsteps approaching the room. She entered naturally with the coffee tray, lowering her eyes exactly as an ordinary housekeeper would. Nathan barely acknowledged her presence before collecting his briefcase and leaving to join Ethan and the other executives. Yet as he disappeared down the hallway, Evelyn Whitmore understood that the extraordinary experiment she had created to test her future daughter-in-law had uncovered something far more dangerous than questions about a marriage. Hidden beneath wedding plans, family celebrations, and polished public appearances was a carefully constructed strategy designed to fracture trust inside the Whitmore family itself. And if Nathan had been willing to manipulate something as personal as Ethan and Lauren's relationship, Evelyn feared the emergency meeting awaiting them at Whitmore Holdings might only be the opening move in a much larger plan, one capable of threatening not only her family, but the company she and her late husband had sacrificed a lifetime to build. Margaret remained standing in the conference room for several seconds after Nathan Whitmore walked away, her hands still resting on the silver coffee tray as though nothing unusual had happened. Years earlier, before Whitmore Holdings had grown into one of America's most respected private companies, Evelyn Whitmore had learned an invaluable lesson from her late husband. He often reminded her that the most dangerous people rarely announce their intentions through loud threats or dramatic confrontations. They preferred patience. They understood that trust, once weakened little by little, often collapsed under its own weight without anyone realizing who had caused the damage. Nathan's private telephone conversation sounded exactly like the kind of calculated strategy her husband had warned her about decades earlier. Yet Evelyn refused to allow emotion to replace discipline. She still needed evidence that would withstand scrutiny, not merely observations that could be dismissed as misunderstandings. If she exposed Nathan too early and proved to be wrong, she would permanently damage relationships inside her own family and possibly destroy Ethan Whitmore's confidence in her judgment. That was a risk she simply could not afford. So she quietly returned to her duties as Margaret, reminding herself that patience had built Whitmore Holdings from a modest family business into a company employing thousands of Americans. Patience would reveal the truth here as well. Meanwhile, Ethan, Lauren Mitchell, Nathan, and the executive team departed for the emergency meeting, leaving the mansion unusually quiet for the first time in days. As the gates closed behind the convoy of vehicles, Evelyn found herself alone with something she had carefully avoided throughout this entire experiment: her own thoughts. She replayed every important moment since arriving under the identity of Margaret: the shattered crystal vase, Lauren's harsh public reaction, the heartfelt conversation with Patricia Mitchell, Lauren comforting the frightened kitchen assistant, the unfinished letter expressing genuine love for Ethan, Nathan quietly encouraging division whenever opportunities presented themselves. None of those moments existed independently anymore. They had begun forming a pattern, one that seemed increasingly difficult to ignore. Yet there was still one missing piece. Evelyn still did not understand why Lauren had reacted so differently on the day the crystal vase shattered compared to every interaction that followed. Until she answered that question honestly, she knew her investigation remained incomplete. Several hours later, the mansion's head housekeeper approached Margaret, carrying a small storage inventory that additional wedding deliveries arrived. Together, they entered one of the downstairs storage rooms that had not been opened for several days. While organizing shelves filled with decorations, Margaret noticed something unusual sitting inside an unlabeled cardboard box placed behind several cleaning supplies. Curious, she carefully removed the box and discovered it contained security maintenance records, duplicate access cards, and several printed schedules showing the movements of household employees over the previous month. The documents should never have been stored there. They belonged inside the security office. Before Margaret could examine them further, the head housekeeper casually mentioned that Nathan had personally requested copies of employee schedules several weeks earlier because he claimed the wedding planners needed to coordinate vendor access with household routines. At the time, no one questioned the request. Nathan frequently involved himself in wedding logistics, and everyone assumed he was simply helping Ethan reduce unnecessary stress. But as Evelyn quietly studied the schedules, another troubling realization emerged. Whoever possessed those documents would know exactly where every staff member was expected to be at specific times throughout each day. That included Margaret herself. It also included the precise afternoon when the crystal vase had fallen. Evelyn carefully returned every document exactly where she had found it, resisting the temptation to investigate further until she understood why Nathan had wanted such detailed information in the first place. Experience had taught her that answers discovered too quickly often led investigators toward the wrong conclusions. By late afternoon, Ethan and the executives returned from Whitmore Holdings, looking far more exhausted than when they had left. The emergency meeting had apparently ended without disaster, but everyone could sense that important discussions had taken place behind closed doors. Ethan thanked the household staff for keeping everything running smoothly during the day's unexpected disruption, before excusing himself to review additional documents inside his father's old study. Lauren followed a few minutes later carrying 2 cups of coffee, hoping to encourage him after what had clearly been a difficult day. Nathan arrived shortly afterward, offering to assist Ethan with several financial reports that supposedly required immediate attention. Margaret quietly dusted the hallway outside the study, unnoticed as always. Through the partially open doorway, she observed a conversation that revealed far more through body language than spoken words. Ethan appeared frustrated by the pressure surrounding both the business and the approaching wedding. Lauren reassured him that no corporate challenge mattered more than their relationship, and suggested postponing non-essential wedding decisions until the company stabilized. Nathan immediately disagreed, insisting that delaying anything would signal weakness to investors, competitors, and the media. He subtly shifted the conversation toward responsibility, arguing that great leaders could never allow personal emotions to interfere with business obligations. Ethan listened thoughtfully, caught between two people he deeply trusted. Lauren encouraged balance and family. Nathan encouraged constant ambition and independence. Neither raised their voice. Neither appeared unreasonable. Yet Margaret noticed something else entirely. Every time Lauren helped reduce Ethan's stress, Nathan quietly redirected the conversation back toward pressure, expectations, and proving himself. It was almost invisible unless someone watched carefully from beginning to end. Evelyn no longer believed these moments were happening by chance. Someone seemed determined to keep Ethan emotionally exhausted because tired people often question their instincts and relied more heavily on whoever appeared confident. As evening settled over the Whitmore mansion once again, Evelyn realized the greatest danger facing her son might not be deception disguised as love. It might be manipulation disguised as guidance. And before this remarkable story reached its conclusion, she intended to discover exactly how far Nathan Whitmore was willing to go to achieve whatever outcome he had been quietly pursuing from the very beginning. The next morning, Evelyn Whitmore awoke before anyone else in the mansion, just as she had every day since becoming Margaret. Years of building Whitmore Holdings had conditioned her to begin each morning before sunrise, believing that the quietest hours often produced the clearest thinking. Dressed once again in the simple housekeeping uniform that had successfully hidden one of America's most recognizable business leaders, she walked through the silent corridors carrying fresh linens toward the guest wing. The mansion appeared peaceful, but she knew appearances had become the least reliable thing inside those walls. Every conversation, every expression, and every seemingly ordinary interaction now carried the possibility of revealing another piece of the truth. As she passed Ethan Whitmore's study, she noticed the door standing slightly open. Ethan had apparently worked well into the night because several financial reports remained spread across the large oak desk his late father had once used. A framed photograph of Ethan as a little boy sat beside another photograph showing Evelyn and her husband on the day they officially opened the first Whitmore Holdings office decades earlier. Margaret paused for only a moment before continuing her work. Looking at those photographs reminded her exactly why she had accepted the discomfort of living under another identity. She had not come to the mansion to protect a company. She had come to protect the family that company had been created to support. Somewhere between those two responsibilities, however, the lines had become blurred. Every new discovery seemed to raise another difficult question, instead of providing certainty. She trusted Ethan completely. She wanted to trust Lauren Mitchell. She no longer trusted Nathan Whitmore at all. Yet trust without proof had never been the foundation upon which Whitmore Holdings was built. Evidence had always mattered, and Evelyn intended to find it before revealing who she truly was. Later that morning, wedding preparations resumed with renewed energy after the previous day's corporate emergency. Designers arrived carrying fabric samples for the reception hall. Florists delivered additional arrangements for approval. Photographers discussed lighting plans, while event coordinators reviewed seating charts one final time. Lauren moved confidently from room to room, greeting everyone warmly and thanking the vendors for adjusting their schedules after the unexpected delay. Margaret quietly assisted wherever she was needed, polishing silver, serving trays, arranging flowers, and preparing refreshments for the growing number of visitors. Around midday, another small incident unfolded that immediately captured Evelyn's attention. One of the younger decorators accidentally knocked over an expensive display of imported porcelain centerpieces while carrying equipment through the ballroom. The crash echoed throughout the mansion. Everyone instinctively turned toward the sound. The young employee froze in absolute panic, staring at dozens of shattered pieces scattered across the polished wooden floor. Margaret watched Lauren carefully, remembering once again the day the crystal vase had shattered in almost identical fashion. This time, however, Lauren's response was immediate and remarkably composed. She rushed toward the frightened decorator, asking first whether she had been injured before even looking at the damaged porcelain. The young woman apologized repeatedly, explaining that it had been her first week with the company and that losing this job would devastate her family. Lauren gently interrupted her, assuring her that accidents could happen to anyone and instructing the event planner not to deduct a single dollar from the employee's wages. She even knelt beside the frightened woman to help gather the broken pieces herself, despite several others offering to do it instead. Watching from only a few feet away, Evelyn felt an uncomfortable contradiction growing stronger inside her. The compassionate woman kneeling beside the decorator looked nothing like the fiancé who had publicly humiliated an elderly maid after the crystal vase had broken. The difference had become impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Something significant had influenced Lauren's behavior on that first afternoon, and Evelyn became more determined than ever to discover exactly what it had been. That answer arrived sooner than she expected. While cleaning one of the upstairs sitting rooms later that afternoon, Margaret overheard two members of the household staff discussing the incident with the crystal vase. Neither realized she had been present that day, nor did they suspect the elderly housekeeper quietly dusting nearby was actually Evelyn Whitmore herself. One employee mentioned that she still felt terrible for Margaret because she believed the entire confrontation had been completely avoidable. Curious, Margaret casually asked what she meant. The employee hesitated at first before admitting something she had never shared with anyone outside the household staff. Only moments before Margaret entered the living room carrying the crystal vase, Nathan Whitmore had quietly asked another employee to move the original display table closer to the entrance because he claimed photographers would soon arrive and the arrangement would look more impressive from that angle. The table had been repositioned in a hurry without anyone realizing one of its legs rested unevenly on the edge of an ornate area rug. As Margaret walked past carrying the heavy vase, her foot caught the slightly raised corner of the rug, causing her to lose balance. Until that very moment, Evelyn had blamed herself for dropping the vase. She remembered believing age and unfamiliar footwear had simply made her clumsy. Now she realized something far more disturbing. Nathan had personally requested the exact change that created the unstable setup. The staff member quickly added that she never considered it suspicious because Nathan had apologized afterward, insisting no one could have predicted what happened. But Evelyn's mind immediately returned to Nathan's private telephone conversation only days earlier when he described the shattered crystal vase as the perfect beginning. Suddenly, those words carried an entirely different meaning. Had Nathan deliberately created the conditions for the accident? Had he anticipated that a public mistake involving the elderly maid might place Lauren under enough pressure to react emotionally in front of family members and wedding guests? Or had he simply recognized an unexpected opportunity and chosen to exploit it afterward? Evelyn could not answer those questions yet, but one fact had become unmistakably clear. The incident that introduced this extraordinary story had not been as random as everyone believed. Someone had quietly adjusted the first domino long before the rest began falling. Standing alone in the hallway, Evelyn Whitmore slowly closed her eyes for a brief moment, realizing that the day she finally revealed herself as Margaret's true identity was drawing closer than ever before. And when that moment arrived, the conversation would no longer be about a broken crystal vase. It would be about the carefully hidden hands that had positioned it there in the first place. Evelyn Whitmore did not confront anyone after hearing the conversation. She had spent too many years negotiating billion-dollar agreements to confuse suspicion with proof. If Nathan Whitmore had intentionally repositioned the display table, knowing it could create an accident, he had been careful enough to leave himself room to deny everything. A poorly placed table could still be dismissed as an honest mistake. An uneven rug could still be blamed on careless preparation. And Lauren Mitchell's emotional outburst after the crystal vase shattered could still be explained as nothing more than wedding stress. Separately, each event appeared harmless. Together, they formed a chain that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Evelyn quietly finished dusting the hallway before returning to the staff quarters, where she kept a small notebook hidden beneath the false bottom of an ordinary sewing basket. Every evening since arriving at the mansion as Margaret, she had recorded the day's observations with precise dates, times, locations, and names. She wrote exactly what she had seen, never what she assumed. She noted Nathan's repeated attempts to influence Ethan Whitmore's thinking. She documented Lauren's acts of kindness toward employees whenever no one important appeared to be watching. She recorded the conversation with Patricia Mitchell, the unfinished letter Lauren had written to Ethan, and now the revelation about the repositioned display table that had led directly to the shattered crystal vase. Reading back through her notes, Evelyn noticed something she had somehow overlooked before. Every major misunderstanding inside the mansion over the previous several weeks had occurred only after Nathan had been present moments earlier. Sometimes he participated directly. Other times he quietly disappeared before the disagreement began. Either way, his presence seemed to linger long after he had left the room. Evelyn closed the notebook slowly. She was no longer searching for isolated incidents. She was beginning to recognize a carefully repeated pattern. That afternoon, Ethan invited several senior executives, trusted family friends, and wedding advisors to the mansion for an informal strategy luncheon following the previous day's emergency meeting at Whitmore Holdings. The gathering was intended to reassure everyone that business operations remained stable while allowing wedding planning to continue without unnecessary delays. Margaret assisted the catering staff throughout the afternoon, moving quietly between conversations that revealed far more than the speakers realized. Most discussions centered on expansion projects, charitable foundations, and the upcoming marriage between Ethan and Lauren. Yet Nathan seemed determined to guide every conversation towards succession planning inside Whitmore Holdings. Whenever someone praised Ethan's leadership, Nathan casually mentioned how difficult it must be for any son to live under the shadow of such an accomplished mother. When another executive complimented Evelyn Whitmore's decades of disciplined leadership, Nathan smiled politely before suggesting that every great company eventually needed a younger generation willing to make bold changes. None of his remarks sounded disrespectful. In fact, many guests nodded in agreement because they appeared perfectly reasonable when heard individually. But Margaret noticed something almost no one else did. Nathan never praised Ethan without quietly comparing him to Evelyn. He never discussed the future without subtly questioning the past. He never encouraged confidence without planting the possibility that someone else might be standing in the way. By the end of the luncheon, Ethan looked thoughtful rather than relaxed. Lauren noticed it too. As the guests began leaving, she gently asked Ethan whether he wanted to postpone several remaining wedding appointments so they could spend a quiet evening together instead. Ethan smiled gratefully, admitting that the previous few days had left him mentally exhausted. Before he could answer, Nathan stepped forward once again, reminding Ethan that an exhausted leader still had responsibilities and that successful people learned to push through personal fatigue. Ethan hesitated. Lauren remained silent. Margaret lowered her eyes as though arranging empty coffee cups, but inside she felt her concern growing stronger than ever. Nathan did not simply offer advice. He consistently encouraged Ethan to ignore his instincts, postpone rest, and distance himself from the people offering emotional balance. It was the same pattern Evelyn had witnessed years earlier when aggressive investors attempted to isolate struggling company founders before convincing them to surrender control. The tactics looked different inside a family than they did inside a boardroom, but the underlying strategy remained remarkably familiar. As evening approached, another unexpected development changed everything. While preparing one of the upstairs guest bedrooms for relatives arriving later in the week, Margaret heard the unmistakable sound of raised voices coming from the private balcony outside Ethan's study. She instinctively paused, recognizing both voices immediately. Ethan sounded confused. Lauren sounded deeply hurt. Without moving closer than necessary, Margaret listened carefully as Ethan asked Lauren why she seemed increasingly uncomfortable whenever Nathan became involved in wedding decisions. Lauren took a long breath before answering. She admitted she had tried to ignore her concerns because she did not want to create conflict within Ethan's family, but she could no longer remain silent. She told Ethan that Nathan frequently approached her when no one else was present, offering advice she had never requested. According to Lauren, he repeatedly suggested that Evelyn Whitmore would never truly accept her because she had not been born into wealth. He insisted that after the wedding, she would need to persuade Ethan to become more independent from his mother's influence if she ever hoped to be treated as an equal inside the family. Ethan immediately looked stunned. He confessed that Nathan had been telling him something remarkably similar, only from the opposite perspective. Nathan had quietly warned him that Lauren might eventually resent the influence Evelyn still held over Whitmore Holdings and that he should prepare himself for disagreements after the marriage. For several long moments, neither Ethan nor Lauren spoke. Then, almost at the same time, they reached the same conclusion. They had each been receiving private conversations that painted the other in a suspicious light, yet neither had shared those conversations because they believed they were protecting the relationship. Standing only a short distance away, hidden behind the partially open balcony curtains, Evelyn Whitmore felt a wave of relief unlike anything she had experienced since becoming Margaret. For the first time since this extraordinary journey began, Ethan and Lauren were no longer allowing someone else to shape their understanding of one another. They were speaking honestly, comparing experiences, and beginning to recognize the invisible thread connecting every misunderstanding. Nathan Whitmore had spent weeks carefully placing distance between two people who genuinely loved each other. But without realizing it, he had just made the mistake that would ultimately expose everything. Because once two people stop listening to whispered doubts and begin comparing the truth directly, carefully constructed deception rarely survives for very long. Evelyn Whitmore remained perfectly still behind the partially open balcony curtains, careful not to reveal that she had overheard the most important conversation since arriving at the mansion as Margaret. Her first instinct was to step forward, remove the gray wig, look Ethan Whitmore in the eyes, and tell him everything she had discovered. She wanted to assure her son that his instincts about Lauren Mitchell had not been misplaced, that the woman he loved had been fighting a battle she never fully understood. She wanted to tell Lauren that the elderly maid she had unknowingly allowed into her life was actually the woman whose approval she had quietly hoped to earn from the very beginning. But Evelyn resisted. She understood that revealing herself too soon could undo weeks of careful observation. Nathan Whitmore remained completely unaware that the foundation beneath his carefully constructed narrative had begun to crack. As long as he believed everyone still trusted him, he would continue behaving naturally. That confidence could become the very thing that ultimately exposed him. Evelyn quietly stepped away from the balcony and returned to her duties, reminding herself once again that timing had always been one of the greatest advantages in both business and life. The truth carried enormous power, but only when revealed at the right moment. Until then, patience remained her strongest ally. Inside the study, Ethan and Lauren continued talking long after the sun had disappeared behind the trees surrounding the Whitmore estate. For the first time in weeks, they spoke without interruptions, assumptions, or outside opinions shaping the conversation. Ethan admitted that Nathan had gradually convinced him his mother might never completely accept anyone into the Whitmore family unless that person came from a background similar to their own. Lauren listened quietly before revealing that Nathan had repeatedly suggested the opposite, insisting Evelyn believed Lauren was only interested in the Whitmore fortune because she had grown up in an ordinary middle-class household. As they compared each conversation, a remarkable pattern emerged. Nathan had never openly criticized either person. Instead, he carefully delivered just enough information to encourage doubt while making it appear as though he was offering sincere advice. Lauren recalled several occasions when Nathan had insisted she should avoid certain conversations with Evelyn because they would supposedly create unnecessary tension. Ethan remembered moments when Nathan subtly encouraged him to keep concerns away from Lauren so she would not become overwhelmed before the wedding. Looking back together, they realized those suggestions had accomplished only one thing. They had prevented honest conversations that could have resolved misunderstandings within minutes. Ethan slowly shook his head in disbelief, confessing that he had trusted Nathan for most of his life. Growing up together had made him believe loyalty came automatically with family. Lauren reached across the desk, gently taking Ethan's hand before reminding him that manipulation often succeeds because it comes from familiar faces rather than strangers. Those words stayed with Ethan long after the conversation ended. Unbeknownst to both of them, Margaret heard every sentence, and behind the disguise of an elderly housekeeper, Evelyn felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Despite everything that had happened, the bond between Ethan and Lauren remained stronger than Nathan had anticipated. Instead of allowing suspicion to separate them, they had finally chosen honesty over assumption. Early the following morning, an opportunity presented itself that Evelyn had not planned, but immediately recognized as significant. Nathan arrived at the mansion earlier than usual, believing almost everyone else was still asleep. Margaret was quietly arranging breakfast trays near the rear service entrance when she noticed him walking toward the private archives room where decades of Whitmore family documents, legal records, and historical company files were securely stored. Access to that room was normally limited to Evelyn, Ethan, company attorneys, and a small number of trusted executives. Nathan certainly possessed authorization as a senior family executive, yet something about his behavior immediately felt unusual. Rather than entering through the main hallway, he looked carefully in both directions before unlocking the side entrance with his access card. Margaret remained hidden behind a nearby storage cabinet, watching him disappear inside. Nearly 20 minutes passed before Nathan emerged carrying nothing visible except a slim leather portfolio tucked beneath his arm. His expression appeared calm, but his movements lacked the confidence he usually displayed. He locked the archive room, adjusted his jacket, and quickly walked toward the driveway where his vehicle waited. Only after he had left the property did Margaret quietly approach the archive entrance. She had no intention of searching through confidential company records, but she did notice something that immediately captured her attention. One of the security seals placed across a cabinet containing original shareholder agreements had been disturbed. The seal had not been broken completely, but it had clearly been lifted and pressed back into place. It was a tiny detail that almost anyone else would have overlooked. Evelyn recognized it immediately because she had personally designed that security system years earlier after an attempted corporate espionage incident. Whoever accessed those files wanted to avoid leaving obvious evidence behind. That realization sent a chill through her. Nathan's interest was no longer limited to influencing relationships inside the family. It appeared to extend directly into the legal structure of Whitmore Holdings itself. Rather than contacting company security immediately, Evelyn quietly returned to the staff quarters and carefully compared the timeline recorded in her hidden notebook. Nathan's increased involvement in wedding planning had begun only weeks before the emergency investor meeting. His private conversations encouraging division had intensified as corporate discussions surrounding future leadership became more frequent. Now he had secretly entered the archives containing original ownership documents while believing no one was watching. Each discovery strengthened the same conclusion. Nathan's objective had never been to stop Ethan and Lauren from getting married. In fact, Evelyn now suspected he wanted the wedding to proceed under exactly the right conditions. A distracted family focused on celebrations, emotional disagreements, and personal misunderstandings would pay far less attention to important decisions taking place inside Whitmore Holdings. If Nathan intended to influence corporate control, there could hardly be a more convenient moment than during the weeks surrounding one of the most significant family events in decades. Evelyn slowly closed her notebook and looked out the small window of Margaret's room toward the grand mansion she and her late husband had dreamed of building together. The disguise had already revealed far more than she ever imagined possible. She had discovered Lauren Mitchell's genuine heart. She had watched Ethan Whitmore choose communication instead of suspicion. And she had uncovered enough clues to know that Nathan Whitmore's ambitions reached well beyond family disagreements. The only question that remained was how much further he was willing to go before someone finally stopped him. Evelyn had a feeling she would not have to wait very long for that answer, because the annual Whitmore Family Foundation Gala was now only 2 days away, and every major shareholder, executive, trusted advisor, and member of the Whitmore family would soon be gathered beneath the same roof. If Nathan intended to make his boldest move yet, there would never be a better opportunity than a night when everyone believed they were celebrating the future. The announcement of the Whitmore Family Foundation Gala transformed the atmosphere inside the mansion almost overnight. Every hallway filled with decorators carrying fresh floral arrangements. Tailors arrived with garment bags containing custom evening attire. Security teams expanded their presence around the estate, while event planners coordinated the arrival of governors, senators, business leaders, philanthropists, and longtime friends of the Whitmore family. For more than 30 years, the annual gala had represented far more than an elegant evening of speeches and charitable donations. It was where major partnerships quietly began, lifelong friendships were renewed, and important conversations often shaped the future of Whitmore Holdings long before official announcements reached the public. Evelyn Whitmore and her late husband had created the foundation to honor the principle that had guided them from the very beginning. True success was measured not only by what a person earned, but also by what they gave back. Every scholarship awarded, every hospital funded, and every community project supported through the foundation carried a small part of their shared dream. As Margaret quietly polished silver serving trays destined for the gala, Evelyn found herself remembering the very first foundation dinner held decades earlier, inside a modest hotel ballroom with fewer than 50 guests. They had possessed very little money then, but they had possessed limitless hope. Looking around the mansion now, she wondered what her husband would think if he could see how much had changed and how one family's celebration had quietly become the setting for a battle over trust, loyalty, and the future of everything they had worked to build. Unlike previous years, however, this gala carried a weight that almost no one else recognized. Ethan Whitmore viewed it as an opportunity to reassure investors after the recent emergency meeting at Whitmore Holdings. Lauren Mitchell hoped it would finally allow her to demonstrate that she belonged beside Ethan, not because of wealth, but because she genuinely shared the family's commitment to serving others. Nathan Whitmore, meanwhile, appeared unusually energetic. He volunteered to oversee guest logistics, coordinate executive seating arrangements, and personally review portions of the evening's presentation. To everyone watching, Nathan simply looked like a devoted family member eager to ensure another successful event. Margaret noticed something entirely different. Nathan seemed less interested in the celebration itself than in controlling who spoke to whom, where people were seated, and how information flowed throughout the evening. Several times she watched him quietly redirect conversations before they could naturally develop. When one senior board member asked whether Evelyn Whitmore might unexpectedly return from Europe for the gala, Nathan smiled confidently and assured everyone that she had extended her vacation because she needed additional time away from corporate responsibilities. Ethan accepted the explanation without hesitation because he genuinely believed his mother remained overseas. Lauren simply nodded politely, though Margaret could not help noticing a brief expression of disappointment crossing her face. Lauren had privately admitted more than once that she wished Evelyn could attend the wedding preparations instead of remaining abroad. That small reaction confirmed once again what Evelyn had gradually come to understand. Lauren wanted acceptance, not access. She wanted family, not fortune. The realization filled Evelyn with both comfort and regret because she knew that every additional day spent, as Margaret delayed the apology Lauren deserved. Later that afternoon, Margaret received an unexpected request that immediately captured her attention. Nathan approached her personally while several staff members organized decorations inside the grand ballroom. Speaking with his usual polite confidence, he asked whether she would deliver a sealed envelope to the executive office at Whitmore Holdings first thing the following morning before returning to assist with final gala preparations. He explained that the contents were confidential financial documents requiring immediate attention from the company's legal department. Margaret accepted the envelope without hesitation, lowering her eyes exactly as an ordinary housekeeper would. Nathan thanked her warmly before walking away to supervise another group of employees. The moment he disappeared around the corner, Evelyn felt the weight of the envelope in her hands. It was unusually thick, far heavier than ordinary correspondence. For several minutes she debated what to do. Throughout her entire experiment, she had deliberately avoided opening private documents or invading confidential communications because she wanted every conclusion to rest upon observable behavior rather than questionable methods. Opening Nathan's envelope would cross a line she had carefully refused to approach, to leave her mind. If Nathan had already entered the archives containing original shareholder agreements and had privately described the shattered crystal vase as the perfect beginning, could she responsibly ignore another opportunity to understand what he was planning? Evelyn carried the envelope back toward the service corridor without making any immediate decision. Before she reached the staff quarters, fate intervened in a completely unexpected way. As she rounded the corner near the library, the envelope slipped from beneath the folded linen she was carrying and struck the polished floor. The seal burst open upon impact, sending several documents sliding across the marble. Margaret instinctively knelt to gather them before anyone else arrived. Her eyes fell upon the first page for only a brief second, yet that single glance was enough to stop her completely. The document was not a routine financial report. It was a draft proposal recommending substantial changes to the voting structure of Whitmore Holdings following Ethan's marriage. According to the proposal, several temporary governance adjustments would transfer additional operational authority to a small executive oversight committee during what it described as the family transition period. Nathan Whitmore's name appeared prominently among the proposed committee members. Ethan's signature line remained blank. Evelyn quickly gathered every page, carefully restoring the documents to the envelope before anyone entered the hallway. She remained kneeling for a few moments longer, allowing the significance of what she had just seen to settle in her mind. Nathan had repeatedly encouraged Ethan to focus on wedding responsibilities while simultaneously increasing his own involvement in company affairs. He had quietly fueled misunderstandings between Ethan and Lauren, attempted to create distance between Ethan and his mother, accessed confidential shareholder records, and now possessed draft governance documents that would temporarily increase his own authority during the exact period when the Whitmore family would be distracted by wedding celebrations. Individually, each discovery might still have been explained away. Together, they painted a picture that Evelyn could no longer ignore. This was no longer merely an investigation into character. It had become a race against time. If those documents reached Whitmore Holdings without Ethan fully understanding their implications, decisions affecting the future of the company could begin moving forward before anyone recognized what was happening. Evelyn slowly rose to her feet, once again becoming Margaret in appearance, even though her thoughts had returned completely to those of the woman who had built Whitmore Holdings from the ground up. She realized the annual Whitmore Family Foundation Gala would no longer be remembered simply as a night of generosity and celebration. Unless she acted wisely, it could become the evening when everything her family had sacrificed to create began quietly slipping into someone else's hands. And for the first time since putting on the gray wig and simple housekeeping uniform, Evelyn accepted a difficult truth. The moment when Margaret disappeared and Evelyn Whitmore stepped back into the light was approaching far faster than she had ever intended. That evening, Evelyn Whitmore sat alone inside the small room assigned to Margaret, holding the sealed envelope in her hands long after the rest of the household had gone quiet. Through the narrow window, she could see the lights of the mansion glowing against the night sky, illuminating the home that she and her late husband had once imagined would become a place where future generations of the Whitmore family would gather in peace. Instead, every room now seemed to conceal another unanswered question. She looked once more at the notebook hidden beneath the sewing basket, turning page after page until she reached the very first entry she had written after arriving at the estate under her assumed identity. It simply read, "Observe, do not judge too quickly." She smiled faintly at those words because they reminded her why she had begun this remarkable journey in the first place. She had entered her son's home, believing she needed to discover whether Lauren Mitchell truly loved Ethan Whitmore or merely loved the extraordinary life attached to the Whitmore name. Now, weeks later, she realized that question had almost answered itself. Lauren had consistently shown compassion to employees, protected those who made mistakes, comforted people who expected punishment, and chosen honest conversations with Ethan instead of allowing suspicion to grow. The only moment that continued to trouble Evelyn remained the day the crystal vase shattered across the polished marble floor. Yet even that memory no longer appeared as straightforward as it once had. Nathan Whitmore had repositioned the display table. Nathan had quietly encouraged misunderstandings afterward. Nathan had referred to the incident as the perfect beginning. The more Evelyn examined every detail, the more convinced she became that the opening scene of this extraordinary story had been carefully influenced long before anyone realized they were participating in it. She no longer believed Lauren's outburst had defined her character. Instead, it appeared to be the emotional reaction Nathan had been hoping someone would have, creating the first crack in the trust holding the Whitmore family together. The following morning, preparations for the Whitmore Family Foundation Gala entered their final stage. Luxury vehicles arrived carrying floral designers, lighting technicians, musicians, and charitable partners who had supported the foundation for years. Invitations had been accepted by governors, judges, respected business leaders, university presidents, hospital directors, and community organizations whose lives had been transformed through the foundation's work. Ethan Whitmore spent most of the morning reviewing his speech, hoping to honor both his late father and the legacy his mother had created without knowing she was quietly serving breakfast only a few rooms away. Lauren Mitchell moved through the mansion checking final arrangements with remarkable attention to detail. Margaret watched her pause several times to personally thank employees who had worked late into the night preparing for the event. She noticed Lauren delivering breakfast to exhausted decorators before they even asked. She saw her quietly hand a generous tip to one of the drivers, after learning he had traveled several hours to make an early delivery. Most importantly, she watched Lauren stop beside Samuel, the elderly gardener whose arthritis had caused him to damage the decorative fountain days earlier. Samuel had returned after receiving medical treatment, insisting he wanted to finish preparing the gardens before the gala, despite lingering discomfort in his hands. Lauren gently encouraged him to rest instead, reminding him that flowers looked their best when the people caring for them were healthy enough to enjoy them. Samuel smiled with gratitude, clearly touched by her concern. Margaret felt her eyes fill with emotion as she observed the exchange. She thought about how often wealth caused people to overlook those whose work made comfortable lives possible. Yet Lauren consistently noticed them. She remembered their names, asked about their families, and treated them with dignity regardless of whether Ethan happened to be nearby. Evelyn quietly admitted something to herself that she had been resisting for days. If Lauren had entered the Whitmore family years earlier, her late husband would have admired her immediately. That realization carried both comfort and sorrow because Evelyn knew she owed this young woman more than simple approval. She owed her an apology. Meanwhile, Nathan Whitmore appeared increasingly confident as the gala approached. He moved through the mansion greeting arriving executives with practiced charm, discussing investment opportunities with board members, and reassuring everyone that Whitmore Holdings remained stronger than ever, despite recent uncertainty. Margaret observed something else that few others noticed. Nathan checked his watch constantly. He made several brief telephone calls from secluded corners of the property. He quietly confirmed seating arrangements with event coordinators, even though those responsibilities normally belong to the foundation's staff. At one point, Margaret watched him step into the library where Ethan's speech for the evening had been left on a writing desk. Nathan glanced around to ensure he was alone before carefully opening the folder and reading several pages. He did not remove anything or visibly alter the contents. Instead, he appeared to be confirming something before closing the folder exactly as he had found it. Margaret remained hidden behind the partially open doorway, her concern deepening with every passing hour. Nathan was behaving like a man preparing for a carefully timed event, rather than someone simply attending a family celebration. Whatever he intended to accomplish, Evelyn sensed it would happen before the evening ended. She also realized something equally important. The gala would place every significant figure connected to Whitmore Holdings in the same ballroom at exactly the same time. Ethan would be there. Lauren would be there. Senior executives, legal advisors, shareholders, longtime family friends, and respected community leaders would all witness whatever unfolded next. Nathan probably believed that gathering created the perfect opportunity to strengthen his influence. Evelyn saw something entirely different. It would provide the perfect audience for the truth. As she quietly adjusted Margaret's simple housekeeping uniform before returning to help prepare the ballroom, she looked at her reflection in the small mirror hanging inside the service corridor. Behind the gray wig, the modest glasses, and the gentle expression of an elderly maid, stood the determined woman who had built Whitmore Holdings from a single rented office into one of America's most admired companies. She had remained silent long enough to understand the full picture. Now she needed only one final piece of undeniable evidence before the disguise ended forever. And judging by the confidence Nathan carried as guests began arriving through the mansion's grand entrance, Evelyn believed that final piece of evidence was about to reveal itself before the first toast of the evening was ever raised. As the first luxury vehicles rolled through the wrought iron gates of the Whitmore estate, Evelyn Whitmore understood that there would be no second opportunity after tonight. For weeks she had lived as Margaret, quietly serving coffee, polishing silver, making beds, and becoming almost invisible inside the very home she had built alongside her late husband. She had witnessed conversations people would never have shared in front of the billionaire whose signature appeared on annual reports and charitable foundations. She had watched Ethan Whitmore reveal the same humility that had made her proud since he was a little boy. She had discovered a side of Lauren Mitchell that no amount of background investigations could ever uncover. She had also watched Nathan Whitmore patiently position himself closer and closer to the center of both the family and Whitmore Holdings. None of it had happened through dramatic confrontations or obvious betrayals. Every move had been small enough to escape notice. Every conversation had sounded reasonable when heard by itself. Every suggestion had appeared helpful. Looking back, however, Evelyn could finally see the complete picture. Nathan had never needed people to believe his lies completely. He only needed them to question each other long enough for trust to weaken. Once trust began to disappear, people naturally stopped comparing stories, stopped asking direct questions, and started relying on assumptions instead of honest conversations. That was exactly what he had been counting on. Fortunately for Ethan and Lauren, they had unknowingly interrupted that strategy the night they finally spoke openly inside the study. Nathan had believed he was controlling every conversation, but he had overlooked one important truth. Genuine relationships grow stronger through honest communication, while manipulation depends upon silence. The moment Ethan and Lauren began comparing what Nathan had privately told each of them, the foundation beneath his carefully constructed narrative had started collapsing. Inside the grand ballroom, hundreds of employees worked with remarkable precision to ensure every detail reflected the standards the Whitmore Foundation had become known for over the past 3 decades. Crystal chandeliers illuminated elegant floral displays stretching across the room. Portraits honoring Evelyn Whitmore and her late husband stood beside exhibits showcasing hospitals, schools, scholarship recipients, and community projects funded through the foundation's generosity. Margaret quietly walked among the final preparations, carrying polished serving trays, while guests gradually filled the ballroom. Governors greeted university presidents. Philanthropists embraced longtime friends. Business leaders discussed economic forecasts before turning their attention toward the evening's charitable announcements. Several people commented on how unfortunate it was that Evelyn Whitmore remained overseas during such an important event. Nathan politely repeated the explanation he had offered for weeks, assuring everyone that she deserved time away after decades of relentless work. Ethan smiled politely whenever someone asked about his mother, though Margaret noticed a trace of disappointment behind his eyes. He had spoken with Evelyn several times through carefully arranged telephone calls during her supposed European vacation, never realizing those conversations had actually taken place from a secure apartment less than 30 minutes away. Lauren appeared equally disappointed. More than once throughout the evening, she found herself looking toward the ballroom entrance as though hoping Evelyn might unexpectedly walk through the doors after all. Margaret quietly observed those moments without revealing the emotion they stirred inside her. She remembered reading Lauren's unfinished letter, the one expressing her deepest hope that Evelyn would one day believe her love for Ethan had nothing to do with the Whitmore fortune. That letter had never been intended for anyone else's eyes, making every word impossible to dismiss as performance. Standing only a few feet away while Lauren unknowingly searched the crowd for the woman hidden beneath a housekeeping uniform, Evelyn felt the weight of every incorrect assumption she herself had carried into this remarkable experiment. She had spent weeks testing Lauren's heart, only to discover that the person most challenged by this journey had been herself. The evening officially began as Ethan stepped onto the stage to welcome everyone to the annual Whitmore Family Foundation Gala. His speech reflected everything Evelyn had hoped her son would one day become. He spoke less about financial success than about responsibility. He thanked employees before executives, volunteers before investors, and community leaders before politicians. He honored his late father for teaching him that integrity could never be measured on a balance sheet, and praised his mother for proving that compassion and discipline could exist together inside the same leader. Listening from the back of the ballroom beside the other household staff, Margaret felt tears quietly gathering in her eyes. Every sacrifice she and her husband had made suddenly felt worthwhile. Ethan concluded by announcing the largest scholarship expansion in the foundation's history, earning a standing ovation from the audience. As applause echoed throughout the ballroom, Nathan Whitmore remained smiling, but Margaret noticed something unusual. Rather than celebrating alongside everyone else, he discreetly checked his wristwatch before exchanging a brief glance with one of the company's outside legal advisors seated near the front. The exchange lasted only a second, yet it immediately caught Evelyn's attention because it matched the same behavior she had witnessed repeatedly over the previous several weeks. Nathan was waiting for something. He was measuring time with unusual precision. He looked less like a guest attending a charity gala and more like someone anticipating the exact moment a carefully arranged plan would begin unfolding. Margaret quietly shifted her attention toward the legal advisor Nathan had acknowledged. She recognized him immediately. He specialized in corporate governance and executive restructuring. Suddenly, the draft proposal that had spilled from Nathan's envelope days earlier returned vividly to Evelyn's mind. The temporary governance committee, the proposed transfer of operational authority, Ethan's blank signature line. Nathan's repeated efforts to keep Ethan overwhelmed with wedding preparations and corporate responsibilities. Every clue pointed toward the same conclusion. Tonight's celebration was not merely about honoring the Whitmore Foundation. Hidden beneath the speeches, charitable announcements, and elegant smiles, someone intended to place documents before Ethan while his attention remained divided, hoping he would approve changes whose true consequences might not become obvious until it was far too late. Evelyn slowly tightened her grip on the silver serving tray she carried. She had waited patiently for weeks, gathering facts instead of assumptions. Now, as Nathan confidently rose from his chair and began walking toward the stage carrying a leather portfolio that looked remarkably similar to the one Margaret had seen earlier, Evelyn understood that the final act of this extraordinary story had quietly begun. Whether Nathan realized it or not, he was only moments away from making the one mistake that no amount of planning, charm, or carefully crafted deception would ever allow him to undo. Nathan Whitmore walked toward the stage with the confidence of a man who believed every variable had been accounted for. The leather portfolio rested comfortably beneath his arm, as though it contained nothing more significant than another routine set of board documents. Guests continued applauding Ethan Whitmore's speech, unaware that Nathan was carefully waiting for the applause to fade before making what appeared to be a thoughtful contribution to the evening. Margaret remained near the rear of the ballroom beside several members of the catering staff, her silver serving tray balanced effortlessly in her hands, while her attention never left Nathan for a single moment. Years of negotiating billion-dollar agreements had taught Evelyn Whitmore to study people's timing more carefully than their words. Honest people generally responded to events as they unfolded. Manipulative people preferred creating moments that appeared completely natural while quietly steering others toward predetermined decisions. Nathan had displayed that habit repeatedly throughout the past several weeks. He waited until Ethan felt overwhelmed before offering advice. He approached Lauren only when she questioned whether she truly belonged within the Whitmore family. He repositioned conversations just enough to influence emotions without appearing responsible for the outcome. Now he had chosen the precise moment when hundreds of respected guests were celebrating the foundation's success to introduce something that clearly extended beyond charitable work. Evelyn had no doubt that whatever rested inside the leather portfolio represented the true reason Nathan had appeared unusually calm. Despite every challenge surrounding the wedding and Whitmore Holdings, he had not been reacting to circumstances. He had been patiently guiding them toward this very evening. Nathan reached the podium wearing the same reassuring smile that had earned him the trust of executives, relatives, and longtime family friends. He began by congratulating Ethan on a remarkable address, praising his leadership and expressing admiration for the values established by Evelyn Whitmore and her late husband decades earlier. Every sentence sounded sincere. He thanked the foundation's donors, recognized scholarship recipients seated throughout the ballroom, and spoke warmly about the importance of preserving the Whitmore family's legacy for future generations. Guests nodded approvingly while several executives applauded his remarks. Margaret quietly noticed something else. Nathan repeatedly emphasized words like transition, continuity, stability, and future leadership. Individually, those expressions seemed entirely appropriate for a philanthropic gala. Together, however, they closely mirrored the language Evelyn had seen inside the draft governance proposal that had accidentally spilled from the envelope only days earlier. Nathan then turned toward Ethan, explaining that the board of Whitmore Holdings wished to present him with what he described as a symbolic commitment to the company's next chapter. Before the wedding officially united two remarkable families, he opened the leather portfolio and removed several neatly arranged documents. The audience naturally assumed they were ceremonial certificates connected to the foundation. Ethan smiled politely and stepped forward without hesitation. Lauren, seated beside several foundation trustees, watched with quiet curiosity. Margaret felt her heartbeat quicken beneath the modest housekeeping uniform because she recognized the formatting immediately. Although the audience could not see the contents from their seats, Evelyn knew those pages belonged to the same proposal, recommending temporary governance changes during the family's so-called transition period. Nathan had chosen the perfect setting. Ethan stood surrounded by respected community leaders, longtime investors, judges, and charitable partners. Refusing to review the documents might appear discourteous. Delaying the signing could easily be interpreted as distrust toward his own family. Nathan had carefully created a situation where social expectation encouraged immediate cooperation. Just as Ethan accepted the folder, something happened that Nathan had clearly never anticipated. Before Ethan could lower his eyes toward the first page, Lauren gently reached across and placed a hand on his forearm. She smiled warmly at the audience before speaking in a calm voice that carried through the silent ballroom. Lauren suggested that documents affecting Whitmore Holdings deserve the same careful attention Ethan gave every important decision inside the company. She added that celebrating the foundation's achievements should remain the evening's priority and proposed reviewing any corporate paperwork together with legal counsel after the gala concluded. Her words were respectful, measured, and impossible to criticize without appearing unreasonable. The audience responded with approving smiles, several guests quietly applauding her thoughtful suggestion. Ethan immediately nodded in agreement, thanking Lauren for reminding him never to rush decisions simply because they arrived during important public moments. Nathan's expression changed for only the briefest fraction of a second before returning to its familiar confidence, but Margaret noticed it immediately. It was the first genuine crack she had seen in his composure. He quickly laughed and assured everyone that Lauren was absolutely right, insisting the documents were merely preliminary recommendations requiring no immediate action. He casually returned them to the leather portfolio while encouraging everyone to enjoy the remainder of the celebration. To almost every guest in attendance, the exchange lasted less than 2 minutes and appeared entirely ordinary. Only Evelyn understood what had truly happened. Lauren had unknowingly prevented Ethan from signing documents Nathan had spent weeks positioning before him at exactly the right moment. Even more remarkable, she had done so without accusing anyone, embarrassing Nathan, or disrupting the gala. She simply encouraged wisdom over urgency. Standing quietly among the household staff, Evelyn felt an overwhelming sense of admiration for the young woman she had once suspected of loving her son for all the wrong reasons. Nathan had expected Lauren to become another piece in his carefully arranged strategy. Instead, she had unknowingly become the first person to stop it. Watching Nathan calmly return to his seat while discreetly tightening his grip on the leather portfolio, Evelyn understood that his original plan had just failed in front of hundreds of witnesses. Men who spent weeks constructing elaborate strategies rarely accepted failure quietly. They adjusted, they improvised, they searched immediately for another opportunity. And as the orchestra began playing softly while dinner service commenced throughout the grand ballroom, Evelyn Whitmore realized the most dangerous part of the evening had not ended with Nathan returning to his seat. It was only beginning because a man whose carefully prepared plan had just slipped beyond his reach was unlikely to leave the Whitmore Family Foundation Gala without attempting one final move that could change everything. Dinner service began with the same elegance that had defined every Whitmore Family Foundation Gala for more than 3 decades. Yet beneath the polished speeches, crystal glasses, and carefully rehearsed smiles, Evelyn Whitmore could feel the atmosphere changing. Nathan Whitmore had recovered quickly after Lauren Mitchell encouraged Ethan Whitmore to postpone reviewing the governance documents, but years of leading Whitmore Holdings had taught Evelyn that disappointment often revealed itself in the smallest details. Nathan's smile remained exactly where it belonged. His posture never changed. He continued greeting guests with effortless confidence. Yet his eyes told a different story. They no longer carried the relaxed certainty of a man watching his plan unfold exactly as expected. Instead, they moved constantly around the ballroom, studying conversations, measuring opportunities, calculating alternatives. Evelyn recognized that expression because she had seen it across negotiating tables throughout her career. It belonged to someone whose original strategy had failed, but who refused to leave without creating another advantage. Quietly carrying trays between the tables, Margaret observed Nathan excuse himself from a conversation with several foundation donors before disappearing through a side corridor leading toward the executive lounge adjacent to the ballroom. Only a handful of senior Whitmore Holdings executives, board members, and family representatives were authorized to enter that room during the gala.